how's it going? How's it going, everybody? My name is Jake Tiger. I am a enrolled Seminole. I'm from the Tom Palmer Band and Bear Clan. And I know on the flyer it did say we had Edwin Marshall, but unfortunately he couldn't be here today. So we got Rodney Factor, which he is the band chief for the largest band here in the Seminole Nation, the Tuscany Harjo. He's a very well-spoken historian. He observes the Seminole worldview. He's very neutral speaking. He's a great resource to us in helping spread cultural and historical knowledge within the Seminole Nation. What we did today, we're very excited to present here today. I put together a slideshow, and I didn't want to go too elaborate. I'm going to speak on more stuff. I don't want to overwhelm anybody. So of course you can ask any questions you'll have. We'll answer them at the end. And so let's get started on it. There we go. So when we talk about the Southeastern people, it's kind of more of like a cultural setting. And it's a lot different than what you're going to see in the plains or in the Northwest or down there in New Mexico. As far as Seminole Muskogee culture goes, we live in like permanent structures, which we had permanent towns, and those towns what we became as bands, what we call them later now. So those we call tribal towns. We lived in what we call the mound builder eras. We had these great gigantic mounds that were kind of the center of our communities, and we all lived in homes that were kind of sectionalized by your clan. And when we say clan, we get that from our mothers. We follow a matrilineal rule or a matrilineal society, where we get that from our mothers. So our moms are the ones that give us our life and our identity as well. And a lot of our food was agricultural based, as we were living in permanent structures, mostly along waterways. It was very easy to travel, and the soil was so rich that we can grow corn, beans, pumpkins, all that stuff down there. And also with the exception of hunting wild game throughout the year. Whether the men were out mostly out hunting, while the women were staying inside the towns, keeping the house together. They were doing brain tanning, cooking, all that great stuff for us. And the men were out hunting throughout the year. And we kind of went by seasons. We didn't, just completely just mow down the whole population of deer. We also hunted rabbits, squirrels, which you would use as smaller weapons for that, a blowgun for those type of small game. So that went on throughout the years, and that's how we kind of lived our lives back then. It was really interesting when you start really get to go back into it and really just fully immerse yourself in that and kind of envision what that life would have been like. And that's something that's not really talked about a lot. Rod, you got anything to say?
No, I mean, that pretty much says it, and I think our people, like you were saying, they hunted for subsistence, to the foods they grew, and the other wild things, berries, and all of those that they helped supplement their diets, medicines and stuff. And I think they were really concerned about, the earth and trying to keep things in balance. Of course, it was a time that came, after contact, when they started trading a lot of buckskin, deer pelts and stuff like that, and they were overhunted at that time. Of course, there was a lot of fishing and stuff, and a lot of things changed upon contact. Some of the stuff I read, of course, whenever they first made initial contact with European people, that our people were living, like Jake had said, there in different types of huts, with kind of what we call wattle and dog now, and thatched roofs. They had a complex society that they followed annually with the moon cycles and other things that that kind of commanded those things, you know, in everyday society, and they honored those things, you know, Mother Earth, Creator, and those kind of things that they honored. Of course, you know, with the coming of Europeans, then there became more strife in that area, you know, and I think even more division came about, and that's kind of where you know, Seminole came into existence, that term anyway.
So on that note, Rodney said Seminole. So really, who are the Seminoles when we're trying to identify what we are? So a lot of times people refer to us as a tribe, which is inaccurate. More respectively, I would rather go by a nation, because we have our own commonalities, but we'll all have our own separate identities. So while the Seminoles were smaller tribes from the Georgia, Alabama, Florida area that came together around that time period after contact, and they all spoke different languages. We had they spoke Miccosukee, Muskogee, Hedgity, Chiaha language, all that. And the tribes before that, also down here, a lot of what we call the ancient tribes. From my own understanding, I don't believe they're extinct. They still live through us, through our people that are here today. They just kind of had to give us some of that identity, but it still lives through them. The Calusa, Temuco, Appalachia, all those people that's still existent here to this day. And so when we're trying to identify Seminoles, we have our own band structures that we go by to present day, actually. We have 12 bands and 2 freedmen bands. So I'll get to that later throughout the slideshow. And so we have our own band system. And so when we say a band, that's what there would be like a tribal town. And so that would have been a tribe within itself. So we have, and in actuality, we would have, you know, 12 tribes within one nation. So that's what we kind of put that together, just say the Seminole Nation. That way we don't lose our identity by trying to homogenize us into one group. And so, but it's really interesting. We really get to learn about that. Reading through all these books, a really good source talking about the first contact with Seminoles, William Bartram. He has a lot of good writings about that. You can buy that off Amazon if you read about it, but it's really, really interesting just to see about that. Because there's some of that stuff in that oral history that we have passed down. We can only just envision that, but once you really get some of that writing down there and even visuals as well, to see what that life would have been like, so we can never fathom to see what that type of lifestyle would have been like for the Seminole people. And so when we got our name Seminole, there's some interpretations. Some will say it came from the Muskogee language, or we came from the Spanish, from the word Cimarrons, which means runaways, rebels. And so the English kind of basically misinterpreted Cimarrones and called them Seminoles. And so that's how that name kind of comes about. That's still kind of up to speculation how that name came about. And so, but that's the official name that we have for ourselves. And like I said, we have our own band system. So some people would rather be called what their band was. So Rodney, his band is Tuskegee Harjo, but the original name was Oconee. So that'd be, if you'd rather be called Oconee or you'd rather be called Seminole, it's just up to interpretation to whoever feels comfortable to that individual. And so when we're talking about Seminoles, all of them coming together at once, what it really was the encroachments of white settlers coming in from the United States, because Florida was a Spanish territory. And so that encroachment of settlers coming in and taking their slaves back from runaway plantations in Georgia and Alabama, those runaway slaves came to Seminole territory. We treated them like human beings and gave them a safe freedom. And so that became a lot of, started a lot of conflicts as well, along with the idea of manifest destiny within the trying to take over indigenous lands and what they call kill the man or kill the native and save the man. And so that was the rule back then, was to do away with the Indian and assimilate them. And so that's where we started to see a lot of conflicts. And so the Seminole Wars is kind of like a buildup, because we also have the Restic Wars with the Muskogee people years before that. So there's a lot of conflicts going on within a lot of tribal nations at this time, because there's a lot of unwanted encroachments onto tribal lands. They're coming and tell us, well, how we're living our lives is wrong. And so there's a lot of conflict in that divide. And so, and in reality, we signed our treaties that we wanted to stay where we are in our motherlands. And so, I mean, and war is not fun. It's cool to read about, but no one wants to go to war and take a life, or so that there's a lot of I would say just a lot of heartache to our people, to send our men out into war, but that's what we had to do to protect our people, our women, our children, the elders, and the land, our way of life. So that was an option at the time. So with that encroachment coming on, and then we have the Indian Removal Act signed by Andrew Jackson. That was one of the biggest ones that took a lot of what we call the 5 civilized tribes now out of their original homelands down here to Indian Territory. And so with that coming along, we kind of sexualized the Seminole Wars as the first, second Seminole War. But to me, I really just call it Seminole Wars because it was a continuous war of a conflict for 29 years. And so that's where we see a lot of our historical figures come about. And I wrote about them. We got McAnuthy, Osceola, Alligator, Billy Bowlegs, John Jumper, Pascopa, all these people that came about. And they all were fighting for one thing, was to remain Seminole. And so in the Seminole Wars, there's also a lot of misinterpretations I don't agree with. People put in paintings like this one here on an attack. They're fully dressed, wearing the long shirt and shiny metals. And to me, that's not really. I don't think that's accurate. They would have went in using their guerrilla warfare, which would be unseen, a fast strike, hit like thunder, and then disappear. So they would have went in wearing this breechcloth and moccasins, maybe a pair of leggings, but they would have their bodies painted in the traditional colors of black and red. And the weapons they had at the time were flintlock rifles that, where they could get their hands on, it would have been a Northwest trade gun, Kentucky, a Harper's Ferry. Any of those flintlocks at the time would have been used during the Seminole Wars. And those were probably the most effective fighting against the militias, scouts, and the United States Army at the time. They also have their bandolier bags. So this is one I agree with, because the bandolier bags were beaded. And so some of those were found on battlefield sites, so we can justify that. They have them wearing those in battle, or with leather shot bags. Those were used to upkeep your flintlock rifle, keep the tools in there. And if they were using flintlock rifles, they would have used longbows, what we call a tukadachi. That's what they would have used back then, the flat longbows. And the arrows would have been used with river cane. That was very ubiquitous down there in the southeast. They also have war clubs and knives. The English scalpers, Bowie knives, cartouche knives, brooch bellies, all those. So that's what had been used at the time. And Also kind of touching on this for the, so we have the white and red towns. So during the Seminole Wars, the red towns would have been in control because those towns were particularly the ones that led the battles. The white towns, if it was a peaceful time, they would have been in control to keep, I always say, this democracy in between whatever nation they're dealing with at the time to keep it peaceful as possible. When it was time to go to war, the red towns would be having to say so what to do next. And so we go into the next slide. So I mentioned Micanubby. He was the Miko of the Oconee. Miko means chief. And so he comes from the same band that Rodney is here right now. His predecessor, Boldix, passed away in 1819. So he was a hereditary chief, and so he stepped into a role that none of us could really imagine what that would have been like, having to go to war and protect your people and not really knowing what's going to happen next. But he was a very well dignified leader at the time. He led the ambush on what we call the Days Battle, which was the battle happened on December 28th, 1835. They call it Days Battle because most of the Seminole battles, they took out the generals or officers first because they were easy to pick off, and that would have left the troops in disarray. So they call it the Days Battle, which is named after Major Francis Dade. And he had fought there. I think it was like 185 troops against, we don't know how many Seminoles of war at the battle. But in that same battle, Osceola had taken out Thompson with the gun that he gifted Osceola that same day. So this was the biggest battle, or what I kind of call like the Battle of Bighorn before Bighorn was a thing. And so Micanubby was a really good chief at the time, or Miko, I should say. But he was also captured under flag of truce by Thomas Sidney Jessup in 1837. He was taken to Fort Moultrie, then later taken to Fort Gibson, where he died here in Indian Territory in 1848. These two paintings right here, one is by George Catlin and one by Charles Burt King and the McKinney Hall prints. So this is what Seminole men would have been wearing at the time. As you can see, it's a lot different what you would see what I call the John Wayne Indians, where they kind of make us all look the same, long hair and riding on horses. No, that's not really us. We were more focused around textiles at the time, the trade cloths and beads, all that stuff. You can see it was kind of influenced from Spanish and English and French clothing at the time. So it's very elaborate, as you can see. So this one right here is my favorite. This is my lineage. Actually, this is where I come from. Osceola, or accurately told, his name is Osceola. So he's one of our famous Seminoles. If you read about any Seminole or Southeastern native, there's only two names that show up. Most often would be Sequoia and Osceola. And the reason why Osceola is very charismatic, not only being a great warrior, but he was painted a lot. He was talked about the most, so he was very dignified leader. He wasn't a chief, but he was a warrior. And the most famous story about Osceola was him stabbing his knife, or plunging his knife into the treaty Fort Gibson and saying, "This is how I shall sign." It's one of our favorite stories to tell about here in the Seminole Nation. He comes from the Bird Clan. He is from the Tallahassee Charlottetown. And so he fought for, I can't remember how many years that he fought against, but he died at a very young age while he was captured once again by General Thomas Sidney Jessup under flag of truce. Osceola was starting to realize we're running out of supplies, so what he did was worked out a deal with those troops and told them if you surrender, they'll have a good life in your territory. So when he went down there to meet with Jessup and his men, they captured him cowardlessly under a flag of truce. And so he was taken to Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, where he passed away in January of 1838. These two paintings right here is by Robert John Curtis at Fort Moultrie in 1838, and this other one by George Catlin as well. The Robert John Curtis one is probably the most accurate depiction of what OCL would have looked like at the time. As you can see, he's wearing trade cloth again. His mounts were wearing two ostrich feathers, or three, my bad. Two black and one white, always kind of leaning to the side. As you can see, he was very, very well dressed, but not being a chief, but a very well-known warrior for our people. And also added a quote that he had put in 1838 when he was telling General Clinch. He says, "You have guns, and so have we. And you have powder and lead, and so have we. Your men will fight, and so will ours. So the last drop of Seminole blood is moist in the dust of his hunting ground." So you can see how much passion he had for his people to retain that way of lifestyle. And he is a really great figure to look up to, because he, not wanting to be him, but wanting to manifest that ideas that he had about being a real leader, about wanting to retain that way of lifestyle. So that's what I wrote up about him. If you want to read more about him, there's a book by it was Osto's Legacy. It was what's her name? That book.
Patricia Whitman.
Yeah, Patricia Whitman. She wrote a book called Osto's Legacy. So that's a really good one to read about. It's very well detailed to read about him. And so, next we're coming about is the removal. So removal from traditional homelands were in Florida. So they're placed on old slave ships, and our men were basically treated as prisoners of war. They came here in chains and shackles, in the most inhumane conditions you can think of. They were placed on a little island called Egmont Key, just on the west side of a little island of Florida. So they were placed there, loaded onto old slave ships, and then taken to Fort Pike and Jackson Barracks, where that was one stop. So they took the whole ship route to there. And so they're held there for a little while, and then later taken out to Fort Smith, Arkansas, where they had finally later been living in place in Fort Gibson here in Oklahoma, or Indian Territory, as I should say. But the stories of this removal are just stomach turning and just grueling to hear about. You know, the atrocities that were placed amongst the Seminoles, not just for the men, but the women and children and elders. You know, how we were, just weren't considered people at that time. And there was a lot of animosity towards the Seminoles because we fought against the United States the most. So like we can see why the United States would treat us like that. And so there's a lot of oral histories and a lot of writings of what the just a lot of these what I would call human rights violations towards the Seminoles at the time. It's just I always get just angry as you hear about these stories that were done to my people. And so this removal process was not at all just walking the park. It was just they had to walk barefooted at one point because their moccasins were getting holes in them. They had to walk in the snow for hundreds of miles, and with the blankets that were getting holes in them, and they were being withheld rations. So you can kind of get like an idea of what was really happening to them. And so this is something we can never fathom, but we can sympathize with them and just be with them in spirit. And so we talked about Fort Pike, Louisiana. And so this fort was down in New Orleans. So a lot of our Seminoles were held there. A warrior at the time by the name Jumper had died there, and he's still buried there to this day. Unfortunately, the fort has been closed due to hurricanes. It was Hurricane Katrina, I believe, where it started to flood the whole entire fort. So they had to protect that in a way, and then so people really can't go in because it's in a bad condition. But this is one of the removal sites, was Fort Pike, Louisiana. And I didn't really write about Fort Smith, but that was also a removal point as well. But Fort Gibson is the main one, still here in present day Oklahoma or Indian Territory. So the fort was built in 1824, and the first tribal nation to be moved there were the Cherokees. And then the Muskogee Creeks and Seminoles were coming in after that. And the fort was basically made to protect the tribes from raids from the Osage and Comanches and all those tribes around that area that were attacking the fort. They didn't like all these other natives coming in, so they planned raids. So this fort was made here for a holding point, but also to hold up other tribes from the plains that were coming in and try to chase out these tribes that just came on from the Chocolatiers. And so right here on the top right is it's a barracks actually. And then this is built in 1837 by Seminoles with all this limestone taken from the river just a few hundred yards. So this is built by Seminoles, and the visitor center was built by Seminoles as well, and I believe in 1837 as well, or might have been a little bit after that. But a lot of Seminoles were brought here. A lot of our dignitaries, Micanubby, Alligator, John Jumper, Kawakachi was living there, and a whole lot of Miko came to this. So there was a lot of important figures came to here at the time. And it was also a place where Zachary Taylor even stayed in. So this little log cabin right here is where Zachary Taylor had stayed in when the International Treaty Council of 1843 was happening. That's where he would have stayed at, and still up here to present day. And so the fort was actually abandoned in 1859 by all the tribal nations, and was later put back in operation in 1862 when, during the Civil War, it was kind of a supply post at the time. Then later abandoned and put back in operation in the 1890s. It was a headquarters for the Dawes Commission. So I mentioned Hobo Miko. So a lot of people call him Billy the Boldix. That was his English name, but once again, he came from the Oconee band, and he was one of the last Seminole chiefs come from Florida, and he had held out what we call the Third Seminole War. Him and his people had held out for as long as they could, fighting off the troops and trying to resist removal. But he was later talked to with other chiefs here that were brought here in Indian Territory in negotiations that brought him here to Indian Territory. I think it was a little bit after 1858, or I might have been 1857 when he came down here. But he was a very well-known leader. And so these paintings right here, this one has him in 1849, standing next to his son. And the photo of him right here is from Washington, D.C., and a lot of those negotiations. This was taken in 1852 in the wintertime. And he had later died here in Indian Territory in 1858. But the cool thing about Billy Boldix or Hobo Miko he's the only mostly photographed leader at the time. Most of you'll see are paintings. This one is actually on the wet plate photography. There's so many of them, and a lot of sketches of them in the Harper's Weekly. But there's a really cool delegation photo. I think I might have added in here from Billy Boldix. So he was in a lot of these dealings at the time pertaining to Seminole. For the last group of Seminoles come here to Oklahoma. So now we're going to get into the Treaty of 1856. So for us, it's a really big day. He's actually one of the original organizers that is still living to this day. We still observe it every day or every year. So we call it our Independence Day. And on that day, we became a sovereign nation. We were no longer under the jurisdiction of the Muscogee Creek Nation. And that was placed upon us by the United States government because we had such a close culture with the Muscogee Creeks. And so they kind of placed us in their jurisdiction. With Seminoles, we wanted our own identity. And so we kind of, there was a lot of dealings at the time that were, I don't want to say, but there was a lot of dealings at the time with a lot of our dignitaries. And as you can see down here on the bottom right picture is a delegation, those chiefs and councilmen and an interpreter were in a lot of those negotiations with the federal government at the time to get us our own identity, our own lands. And it actually did happen on August 7th, 1856. One person that was really instrumental in that was John Jumper. And he was chief here in the Indian Territory at the time. And so we were granted our own council house, a light horse department. No other government organization can interfere with our own sovereignty. And so, like I said, we observe that every year. We call that our own Independence Day, which we once again recognize every year on August 7th, which is coming up like 2 weeks from now, I believe. And in the top right photo is John Jumper. He was the principal chief, 2 terms, or for 2 different time periods, I should say. But he was really instrumental in putting that together for the Seminoles. So we got past the Treaty of 1856, and in actuality, for the Seminole people, we didn't really have a time of peace for a long period of time in the 19th century, because we had to deal with the Seminole Wars and the removal and our life here at Fort Gibson, and then we're given our own lands, what we call the present day Seminole County. But later, like shortly after that, the Civil War broke out. And so a lot of it was involuntarily. We were forced to fight on each side. If we want to keep our crops or our lands, we had to pick a side, whichever one to fight on. So the Seminoles did fight on both sides. The biggest battle was the Battle of Honey Springs, which happened on July 17th, 1863, I should say. I actually just went down to the battlefield the other day, just to pay my respects to it. But that was one of the biggest battles, with Seminoles fought on both sides. In that battle, on the Union side, you had the Cherokee Nation, Muscogee Creeks, and Seminoles on the Union. And on the Confederates, you had the Choctaw Nation, the Chickasaw Nation, Seminoles, Muscogee Creeks, and Cherokees. That was the biggest battle, what we call the Gettysburg of the West. And there's many more battles. The first battle, the Civil War battle, was a battle around Mountain. And it's really interesting to see how many Civil War battles were fought here in Indian Territory at the time. But a lot of the Seminoles did escape to Kansas with the Bolsey and he was later killed during the Civil War. So a lot of Seminoles did. We're fortunate to escape to avoid conflict with this, because it wasn't really our war. It was between the Feds and the Confederates. It wasn't our fight, but they forced us into it. So some of us did escape to Kansas at the time. So after all this war and destruction, removal, we're finally going to get into Reconstruction. And so we're trying to build up our infrastructure within the nation. And then too, like, so we're still had to face oppression, boarding schools and assimilation. And so we built our own schools. And one of the schools we built was Miccosukee Academy and Omaha, which were run by the Seminole Nation in the 1890s, which were one of the most high-tech buildings here at the time. They had electricity, they had running water. It was fantastic, but it was later taken over by the federal government in the early 1900s. And one of the people that was really wanted the Seminole Nation to rebuild itself was Chief John Chupko, which his nickname was Long John. It was the reason why they called him that, because he was 6'7". He was really, how would I say, a stickler for law and order. He wanted to go by that for the Seminole Nation, for us to be sovereign on our own, be diligent as possible. So we observed a lot of that stuff in the Reconstruction era, with our own light horse, having our own jurisdictions. The council would still at the time decide on our behalf. And so he was really, really instrumental in rebuilding the nation at the time. He had died later during his term, and John Jumper actually taken over for him after that. And so now we're going to get to the present day Seminole Nation. And we have the Constitution, which was ratified in 1869, that was organized under our treaties. It was a pretty long process, about 5 years. It didn't really just come up just like that. There was a lot of reviewing, going to there, observing some of our traditional laws are put into there. But luckily, we still have our own Constitution that was ratified or organized under our treaties. So that's what we recognize today. Like I mentioned before, we had 12 traditional bands and 2 freedom bands. But to me, most importantly, some of us still speak our language and go to our ceremonial grounds and observe at Seminole worldview. So that's the most important. And I also included our 14 bands of Tallahassee, Chiaha, Tawafli, Narcopajo, and follow Fasechi, Hedgity, Tuscagana Harjo, Tom Palmer, Ojeezy, Newcomer, and Caesar Brunner, and those are Barkus bands. So that's what we have today, our 14 bands. We have our own council, which have 2 people, 2 representatives for each band. So we have 28 people. And we have an assistant chief and a principal chief that forms our tribal government. And that's it right there. And Mado means thank you for everyone that sat through this. So if there's any questions, we can clarify any of that.
Great. Thank you, Jake and Rodney. Really appreciate your presentation today. It was very enlightening and gave us and we just appreciate you sharing, the Seminole Nation's history. And I know there's so much more you could talk about, but I know we're at kind of a time crunch, so we're not able to, but we really do appreciate all the time that you've already given today for this. We do have a few questions, so I'm gonna turn it over to Paige if you want to start with that.
Yeah, so everybody put your questions in the Q&A and Leanne and I will facilitate asking Jake and Rodney as you post them in there. I always start with a question that I have asked every one of our speakers, just because a lot of us are archaeologists that are here, and a lot of us are now trying to figure out the best way to work with the tribes and how to go about that. And so what I want to ask first, especially for folks like myself who have been trying to get into this and then learning tribal histories through this series and then in other avenues, why, Jake and Rodney as well, why do you think it is important for archaeologists to engage with the tribes, to learn from the tribes instead of relying upon some books and things that might not be as accurate? And that's my first question.
So from my understanding, a lot of the dealing should be done with the tribal nations, because a lot of our stuff you cannot find in universities, and by certain authors, we still retain a lot of that oral histories. So we should really have the ultimate say-so on what's done within the Seminole Nation.
Thank you, Jake. I have another question here. And they asked, did I understand correctly that Hedgity is a Seminole band?
Yeah, Hedgity is a Seminole band here present day, actually.
Cool. So one other, because you mentioned
really, Hedgity.
Yeah.
I was going to say is that Hedgity, apparently, through history, resided in that area, southeast Georgia, along that coastline before Muskogee Creek proper came into that area, and they spoke a different language. And some of the other bands that came under that Hedgity term too lived in that area. And of course, they were the ones that formed the nucleus of the Seminole Nation and went into Florida. There were some of the first ones that went into Florida and came under that term, Seminole. I think it was officially used first time in 1771, but they were referred to, before that as Seminoles, and all tribes in Florida became under that term, Seminole.
Thank you for that. So one other question, you mentioned throughout your talk, like a few books and resources that you think are good resources to turn to. And I wanted to ask if there were ones that you think, if people want to learn more about Seminole history, which books that you would maybe recommend they look into as being, more accurate depictions of what.
Yeah, so
What is the
two that I mentioned in my mentioned were a book by Dr. Wickman. It was called Osceola's Legacy. That was a really good resource. If you want to get into early days of Seminoles, you would go by William Bartram. He was a botanist at the time and was fortunate enough to document a lot of Southeastern lifestyle at the time. And there's if you really want to go into it, there's a lot of good journals to read by certain officers. Benjamin Hawkins is a really good one to reference. Was
he concerning Seminole Wars and stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of books on Seminole Wars. But yeah, someone I can really recommend. I would just read them all. You really can't get one source of information from just one area. You really got to just absorb it all.
I think if you looked in, some of the books and the authors that did a lot more research, in some of their stuff, and like Jake said, some of those that kept journals during that time period, because when Europeans first came, of course they found the people, that considered themselves free, kind of freedom that we probably don't understand today, that freedom and that sovereignty, existed, before they came here. So they didn't grant us anything in that area, till today. They haven't granted us nothing like that. Those are inherent things, and our people saw the encroachment, and and they put up a resistance, because at one point there was a policy of extermination they wanted to exterminate our people off the face of the earth because they couldn't remove them, you know, and they only did so through trickery and those kind of things. So, you know, we come from a people that introduced guerrilla warfare to the English, you know, and some of those things. But I think the main thing that they only wanted to do was to be free and to, you know, live under their own form of government. And that's why they accepted the reservation in 1823, you know, is to, you know, they thought that that would bring peace. And of course, with more encroachment, you know, from Europeans, and that brought those wars on. But yeah, there's a lot of information in it. You know, some people focus on the history itself and not so much as the wars, where others focus, you know, mainly on wars. So it, you know, you just have to do a little research on that.
Thank you for that. And kind of going off of what y'all were just kind of going over, you know, talking about different sources people can look at. It would also be good for them to reach out to y'all as well, don't you? Wouldn't you say to reach out to Seminole Nation to get the true history on what occurred in the past? Because I think we're all aware that people that have written the history on the tribes, they're not always accurate. I would say are highly inaccurate. So reaching out to y'all would be a good first step as well.
There was a dissertation written by, I think it was Richard Sadler, that, you know, he did a lot of, you know, research and stuff. And I know some of the other folks that we have around here that have done a lot of research in our history, you know, we kind of agreed that, you know, a lot of his stuff was more accurate than some of the others.
There was another question in the chat. Was the removal a single event or did it occur over several years? And what is the relationship between the Florida?
The removal was actually, it was kind of continuous throughout the years. And so there was some that were just being captured a lot of times to get the men to stop fighting, where the troops were going into the villages or towns and taking women and children as hostage and threatening their families to be hung if the men stopped fighting. That happened to Kawakaji. That's how he was brought here to Indian Territory, where his family members were being threatened to be hung if he didn't stop resisting removal. And like I said, it was a continuous process of removal, so it did happen throughout the years. Different groups come at different times. One of the last ones were Billy Boldix group in the 1850s. We called it the Third Seminole War.
You know, they were captured in the fields, you know, and I mean, I say fields, and there was an ongoing war, you know, and they were captured at that time, and they were held in what we would think maybe concentration camps today, until there was a number of them that they felt was enough to start transporting them west. So they came with very little, you know, anything. And of course, they were promised that, you know, these things would be provided to them once they came west. And of course, that was a lie. That didn't happen, you know, and our people suffered greatly as prisoners of war. And like Jake had mentioned, most of our leadership were captured, you know, under a flag of truce. But yeah, and so that went on, you know, and our struggle is still here today, you know, for that sense of sovereignty and to govern ourselves.
And I'll ask another question. So as archaeologists, how do you think archaeology and archaeologists can help support Seminole Nation in what y'all do? And how can archaeology students, professors, CRM help in Seminole, in learning about Seminole history and supporting what y'all do?
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, refer back to us. That's the ultimate one, but also just read about us, learn, hear from our side of the story. You know, learn about why you're digging up be on this job site and learn about why you're here. What are you actually protecting? You know, you got to have your sense of purpose of what you're actually doing with your area of interest. And so that's been, because that will really help in our favor whenever something does come about that pertains to the Seminole Nation. Because if we work together, then we can actually come to an understanding. I know a lot of archaeologists do not really work in our favor a lot of times, that they're hired by a certain company, but if they're an independent one, I would encourage them to just learn about us, hear our side of the story.
And there's another question regarding for today, like what mission would you ask of, you know, Seminole youth of today to tackle to help the tribe and the bands to endure for the future?
I didn't catch that. Can you repeat that, please?
Sure, no problem. One of the attendees asked, what mission would you ask of the Seminole youth today to tackle for the tribe and for the bands to endure in future?
I'm sure Rodney and I both have an answer for this. Mine personally would be learn the treaties, but most importantly, speak the language and learn about the traditional ways, not just, you know, doing patchwork skirts or whatever. It's doing the textiles, learn how to brain tan. But it's just observing a similar worldview of being respectful of the land and for others. You know, treat everyone with kindness and be diligent as possible. Put them before you think of yourself. That's what being a Seminole is really all about. Is helping out one another, not just another human being, but the four-legged, the ones in the waters and the ones in the skies. Those are the ones that we gotta really take into account. But that goes into such a deeper meaning to that when it pertains to Seminole worldview. And I'm sure Rodney has some response to that as well.
Well, I would think kind of like what Jake said, but you know, again, I go back to when Europeans came and they found, you know, our governments, you know, they found that we lived under a democracy, a type of government that they had no knowledge about. We still live under that democracy here, and that's what it's referred to. But our people have a voice in our government, and I've said this over and over in many different forms, in different places, is that we have the most democratic government in the world, or our people have a right to have a say as to the direction that our tribal government goes in. And I think that most of that is through our identity, you know, as a people and as separate bands or tribes, you know, that, and I think that our youth, you know, they need to know that, not only read about it, but it has to be a type of decolonization, you know, or that's embedded in their minds and in their hearts, and they can see the value of that, you know, because there's many tribal governments that have created more like dictatorships through districts and those kind of things. But our people are still, you know, they can still have that freedom, you know, to come to their band meetings when things are being discussed that the council will discuss, because the way our government is set up, that when things are going to be addressed at council level, then we're notified, you know, in a 10-day advance that these are going to be discussed, and so we can schedule band meetings for our bands to come together, and that information disseminated to them, where hopefully they can make an informed decision, and they give it that decision to our representatives who go to the council meeting, and they vote on it, you know, in that democratic way, and they direct the chief to carry those things out. So it's the people, you know, and I've often said that sovereignty is invested in the people, not the government, you know, not the administration and not the council, but the people. And we still have that form of government today. And I think that that's what our young people need to know and realize, you know, that these things are in place so that they would always have a say, you know, in their own government and direction that their government goes in.
Excellent. I think that's a great wrap up right there. Those answers that we just got. So I can't say enough how much we appreciate you coming on and being a part of this. And I know that all the participants, we've had several other questions as well. So they may want to reach out to you, Rodney and Jake and Seminole Nation. But again, just thank you for your time. Thank you for the presentation. And we look forward with the Miami Nation with Miss Diane Hunter. So please join us for that. All of that will be up on our the OKPAN Facebook and Twitter pages as well. So thank you again, Rodney and Jake. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, bro.
Thank y'all so much. And bye, everybody. We'll see you at the next one.
Bye.